There, everybody. So we're here with an introduction to vintage. Um, I know that not everybody who is interested in vintage knows everything there is to know about vintage. Um, and by no means do I know everything there is to know. I have observed vintage from afar for the last 10 years. Um, However, I have only been playing Vintage for the last 2 weeks. Previous to that, the last time I played Vintage, it was called Type One. It was called Type One, and let's see, Dark Ritual Hypnotic Spectre was a game-winning play back then. So yeah, it's come a long way. But I wanted to, walk you guys through what the format's all about and get a crash course, I guess. Or if you already know what the format's all about, you can get my opinions and tell me how wrong I am. Which would be fine. I'm a little rusty. Call me out if I do make the mistakes. So, I pulled up the Vintage Restricted list. There are 41 cards in the format that you can only play one of. There are a number of banned cards as well, but these banned cards are for the most part dexterity, like Chaos Orb, or what's the word I'm looking for? Where you have to anti cards like Contract from Below, which by the way is the best Magic card ever printed. 1 black mana, draw 8 cards. You got it. And then there are some new conspiracy cards that were banned because they refer to draft, or not because they refer to draft, because they are conspiracies. So yeah, that's it. But let's take a look. I've broken down the restricted list into functionality. And as we go through it, I'll explain its impact on the format in general. So right to start off with, we have a whole mess of free artifact mana. Or, in the case of Sol Ring and Mana Vault, these should be in this pile. Free artifact mana. So, the format is very condensed. Imagine if in Standard, you could consistently play 2 lands on turn 1. And sometimes maybe even 3 lands. Starting your curve on 3 is very good. So, we've got all these guys that make the format a lot faster than any other format, where turn 1 kills are a thing. These cards compress the format so much. Format like Standard, turn 1 and 2 are like the setup turns, and then the mid game is anywhere in between turn 3 to turn 7, with the late game going, turn 8 to turn 20, it could be. Whereas in Vintage, the setup phase of Vintage is your mulliganing decision. And turn 1, that's your setup. That's like all the time you have to set up. You need to either mulligan aggressively or correctly based on the archetype that you're playing against, or you need to be able to win the game on turn 1 or 2. Obviously, not every game of Vintage is won on turn 1 or 2 because there is interaction. Just because the decks are fast does not mean that they cannot interact with each other. But it does compress the game state. Very rarely, in my experience, will a game of Vintage go past turn 10. I think that the average turn of a Vintage game is about turn 5. I think that's when most games are over. Now, obviously, there are some archetypes that try to build for the long game, like workshop decks. They're actively trying to make the game go longer so that they can deplete all of your resources and stop you from winning. That is a product of how fast the format is, that a deck like Workshop survives and thrives because it is able to shunt the growth of the other decks. So, those are why these are restricted. These produce an absurd amount of mana for their cost. And some of the cards are just too good with other cards. They make easy 2-card I win combinations. So that's why they're restricted. They all produce a ton of mana. Next, we've got our tutors. This format is a format full of 2-card combinations that win the game. And it's got every card ever in history in the format. So all of the hate cards are extremely hateful, and being able to find both your win conditions and your hate finds that consistently leads these guys down to the restricted list. But they are integral to the format itself because it does play a lot of one-ofs and 2-card combinations. Next, we have our card advantage pile. Memory Jar, Windfall. Oh, I should really have had the card up this whole time, instead of you guys seeing my conversation with the editor of Pure MTGO, Joshua Clater. So we've got Memory Jar, Windfall, Time Twister, and Wheel of Fortune that all draw 7 cards. I know that Windfall doesn't always, but it's considered a draw 7. So having all of those in the format as 4-ofs would be gross because the decks would be far too consistent. There's incremental advantage. Oh, and then there's busted advantage with Yawgmoth's Bargain and Necropotence. This is nearly infinite advantage. Resolving these cards often result in a game win. One-shots are Recall, Time Walk, and Thirst for Knowledge, which produce a lot of cards for their cost. And you have to keep restricting cards, or else blue would be by far the only archetype to play. And then you've got card filtering, and Library of Alexandria is repeated card advantage. The card is actually probably safe to come off restricted list because of how fast the format is, but obviously they're hesitant, and maybe they don't want to create $1,000 card playsets, because the card is already a $400 card, I believe, in paper. So making it unrestricted and having people who want to play that archetype, if any existed, would force them to buy 3 more, which would dwindle the supply, forcing the cost to go skyrocketing. And then there's card filtering, Ponder, Brainstorm, and that's it. Although, Preordain is probably next. These cards filter too well. We've got some I Win cards. Time Vault, 2-card I Win the Game combo. Tinker, 2-card I Win the Game combo. Flash is a 2-card I Win the Game combo. And then Yawgmoth's Will and Mind's Desire are virtually always game winners. Sometimes you have to play them for value when you're behind, but you're still getting a tremendous effect for the cost. And then these cards make the format miserable. Balance, Strip Mine, and Trinisphere. They make the format almost unplayable when playing against a deck that would be dedicated with one of these as a 4-of. So, here's a restricted list and a brief overview of the restricted cards' effects on the format. But let's talk about the pillars of the format. There are 5 pillars of Vintage. Almost uniformly, any deck that is being played in Vintage is playing a number of one of these cards, and usually not 2 of any of these cards. So we've got Mishra's Workshop, which is a reusable Black Lotus for artifacts. It's a land, it's uncounterable, and it's hard to interact with. This leads to for the most part, the control prison archetypes in the format. There are a number of differing sub-archetypes, some of them being combo, some of them being aggressive, and some of them being prison. But they all have in common Mishra's Workshop and the ability to create oppressive or untenable board states on the first and second turn. Right now, Mishra's Workshop is, I would say it's the best archetype in the format. It's putting up wins and top 8s consistently everywhere in the world. It's not a localized metagame, it is the fact that it's very good. However, when workshops are very good, the other pillars can build against them and start to prey on them. Next up, we've got Bazaar of Baghdad, which falls under the Dredge pillar. This deck is all about dumping its library into its graveyard as quickly as it can. And, sometimes on turn 2. Dredge decks are by far the best turn 1 deck of the format. They boast, I believe, an 80% plus win rate on game 1s. However, because of that, almost every deck in the format plays a minimum of 5 or 6 hate cards towards Dredge. I believe the safe number is 7. Because the deck is just so fast and so consistent. And for the most part, it does not interact with the opponent at all. It just does its thing and wins on turn 2. Or turn 3. It's also the only deck in the format where you mulligan any hand that does not have Bazaar of Baghdad. There's no other deck in the format, or I believe any format, that will mulligan every hand until it gets the one card it needs. It is correct to mulligan down to 1 card with this deck, so that you have a chance of hitting Bazaar. Next up we have Mana Drain, which is a blanket for all blue decks that aren't Storm combo. And even some Storm combos play Mana Drain. So this could be your blue fish decks. Maybe blue fish decks don't play it. That's a possibility. But your Oath of Druids decks, your Standstill decks, your Pyromancer decks, your Gush decks, some of your Storm decks, your Grixis Control, your Blue Angels, your Bomberman. There's a lot of archetypes that play Mana Drain. And it's easy to see why. You can Mana Drain something on turn 1 or 2 and then untap into something as silly as a Mindslaver. And other times it's just a hard counterspell, but the opponent can never know that you're just holding on to air when you cast Mana Drain. Pillar of the format, pillar of the format, pillar of the format. Then we've got Dark Ritual, which represents your fast combo decks. This could be TPS Storm, or Tropical Storm, Burning Wish Storm, what's the artifact? Goblin Charbelcher, Oops All Spells, a number of decks that run Dark Ritual, with the end game usually being win on the first or second turn. This deck is the reason that a lot of the blue card selection spells are restricted, and a reason why they probably will never nerf workshop decks too hard, because they keep this deck in check. And then lastly, we have Nullrod. Nullrod is generally a creature deck, something akin to Hate Bears that you would see in Legacy or Modern. It usually runs Wasteland and Strip Mine and Nullrods, and then what it doesn't run is the full set of jewelry. Some decks won't run any. Some decks will just run the colors that they play and Black Lotus. But it shuts off, it turns the format from being a compact turn 5 format to forcing the opponent to play at a more reasonable pace. And that allows you to play things like Gadok Teague, which, is going to take 10 turns to win, but it also shuts down some of their cards. So you play all of these spiteful creatures that just put a little bit of pressure in the form of their power and toughness, but also exert a little bit of board pressure, whether it being slowing down their development, slowing down their ability to draw cards, or inhibiting their ability to play cards. It gives the Nullrod deck the time to attack 4 or 6 times to win the game. And that's the format. If I had to take a rough guess about what the rock, paper, scissors of this format is, let's see if I could accurately do that. So here's where I see it is. Dredge decks win every game one. And then if a deck is adequately prepared in the sideboard, Bazaar is on the every other archetype. Pillar is favored against Bazaar games 2 and 3 if they're prepared. But because you do have to win 2 games, it does win some matches here and there. Mishra's Workshop is... We're just going to ignore dredge decks for the rest. Because if you are adequately prepared, it doesn't matter what your main strategy is. You're going to stop them from playing theirs while you play yours. So workshops are very good against combo decks. They beat the heck out of them. Against mana drain decks and null rod decks, I would say that it's probably about 50-50, depending on the archetype and how the players' decks are actually built, if they're built against workshops or not. But I would put either of these on a 50-50, because sometimes workshops is on the draw. Mana drain control decks generally have about a 50%, I would say, about against everything. They might have slightly higher percentage here and slightly higher percentage here, and they could have a slightly lower or a much higher percentage against workshops. When workshops are generally doing well, the mana drain decks will adapt and start playing more hate. I think the Grixis control decks are the best against workshops, followed by Oath of Druid, since its combo is so cheap and it can get it on to play on turn 1. But yeah, this could scale anywhere from like 30-70 to a 70-30. It could scale anywhere in between there, based on the actual archetype and the contents of the decks. And so ritual decks are generally favored against dredge decks because they're faster. Dredge cannot win on turn 1. It can and does consistently win on turn 2. Storm decks can consistently win on turn 1, especially because Bazaar plays no Force of Wills. So, because of that, Storm decks are able to skimp on their sideboard hate against Dredge. And they boast a high win percentage on game 1s against Bazaar. Because even if they're on the draw, they can still win probably, I want to say, like 50% of the time on turn 1. Especially if you're on the draw and you get an extra card in your hand. Against null rod decks, I think that they're generally a little disfavored, maybe 40% to 60. Against mana drains, I would probably put it at 50-50. And then against Mishra's Workshops, I would put it at like a 20% chance to win. You need to be on the draw, and you need to aggressively mulligan into game 1 or turn 1 wins. And it's hard to mulligan into turn 1 wins. And then shop decks. Shop decks are traditionally very good against Workshop. Null Rod, I'm sorry. Null Rod is traditionally very good against Workshop. Because of the way their decks are built, they play creatures which get around one of the Thorn effects, and they turn off Workshop's fast mana. They do still have Workshop itself and the 2-mana lands, but now they don't have all the jewelry helping them accelerate out. And then on top of that, they will generally play anti-artifact creatures in the deck too. So I believe that's favorable here. Here, I think it's actually miserable everywhere. Even with 7 or 8 cards in your sideboard against Dredge, the Null Rod decks are very slow. Giving Dredge the ability to, come up with 2 to 3 pieces of anti-sideboard hate and still win the game. Against mana drain decks, it really depends on what you're targeting with your Null Rod deck. Right off the bat, I would say maybe slightly disfavored. But if you're building against Mana Drain, then you're obviously going to be favored, because you're stopping them from doing what they want to do. And then against Storm decks, I think there's a huge difference on what you're playing against, or what you're planning to play against. If you're planning to play against Blue and Storm, then you should have a very good matchup. You're still going to lose turn 1, because you're not playing Force of Will, if you're not actual Merfolk Fish. And other times you're going to win when you cast, a turn 1 Null Rod, or some other spiteful card. I could see it being very bad, though, if you're not prepared to fight Storm. If you're more prepared to fight Workshops, then you're going to lose against Storm pretty hard. But, yeah, those are my thoughts on the format, and a brief crash course introduction, so that while you're watching, all the videos to come from all of the people who want to produce vintage content, if you saw this and you didn't know, now you have an idea, and you can come to terms better with how decks are built and why pilots are doing what they're doing. So I'll see you guys later.